Welcome. This is the demand video lecture. It's one of 3 video lectures in this set. This one being demand, the next one will be supply, and the following one will be putting them together and have demand and supply. So in this video lecture we're going to look at the determinants of demand, and recall demand represents the buyer or the consumer side of the market. So the determinants of demand are those things that dictate the level of consumption from that side of the market. Then we're going to look at the demand curve, and that's essentially the graphical representation of that demand, and it gives the level of consumption for a given price. And then the last topic we're going to look at is making the distinction between demand and quantity demanded, which is going to be important to understand not only in this section but throughout the rest of the course. Okay, first we're going to look at determinants of demand. The first one we're going to touch on is price. So obviously the price of a particular good is a big determinant of how much you're going to purchase it or whether you're going to purchase it at all, right? And we understand that as price goes up, quantity demanded is going to go down, and vice versa. If price goes down, you are more likely to buy more, and quantity demand is going to go up. So this illustrates a negative relationship between price and quantity demanded, right? And this is essentially the law of demand. So let's first note here price is related to quantity demanded, right? And what you'll see, the rest of the determinants that we're going to go through, they're going to be related to demand. So price is related to quantity demanded, Q sub D, and the other determinants that we're looking at is going to be related to demand, or D. Pointing out the distinction now, and it'll be more clear when we get to that part of this video lecture. So the second determinant of demand is income, right? So our income level is going to be a primary determinant of how much we purchase of a particular good or service, right? But it can have differential effects. It depends on the type of good. One, the normal goods, which we might consider the typical good, income is positively related to demand, right? And this is what we might suspect as the relationship of income increasing means you're going to buy more. So more income, more purchases. And if income decreases, you're going to buy less. But that only applies to normal goods. There are a special case of goods which we call inferior goods, where income is negatively related to demand. So in this case, income increases and you're going to buy less of those goods or services. And then if income decreases, you're going to buy more. So what are some examples of inferior goods? And a few of them would be ramen noodles, generic brands, and those things that are relatively perceived as low quality but cheap. It's very budget oriented items, right? So you can imagine when you start earning more and more income, you are going to buy less of these budget oriented items. The normal goods don't fall into that category. So again, here I would point out that income is related to demand, not quantity demand, like price. So the third determinant we're looking at is prices of related goods. Right, so before, the first determinant we looked at was the price of the good itself. Here what we're looking at is the price of a related good. Not the price of the good itself, but one of a related good. So what's a related good? There's 2 types. One is a complement and one's a substitute. So a complement, those are the goods that you consume with the good in question. So for instance, suppose you're interested in an SUV or a truck. A complement would be gas, right? You consume both of those things together, and you can imagine that if gas prices change, it can affect the demand for SUVs or trucks. And the relationship that you see is the price of a complement, which we denote as P sub C, is negatively related to demand. And why is that the case? Because if you consume these goods together and the price falls, of this complement, then that's going to cause the total cost of using that good to go down. So your demand is going to go up, right? So for instance, gas is if gas prices go up, that's going to have a dampening effect on the demand for trucks. So the other type of related good is a substitute. So these are the type of goods that that are alternatives to the good in question, right? Substitute would be like a Coke or a Pepsi, right? You can buy a Coke, but the substitute is the Pepsi. That's the alternative. And in this case, it's either or. You don't buy them together. You buy one or the other, right? So in this case, the price of the substitute is going to be positively related to the good, or to the demand of that good, right? And that makes some sense, right? If the price of Coke goes up, the demand for Pepsi is going to go up because more people are going to buy less Coke and shift over to the Pepsi, which has become relatively less expensive. Some more examples of complements and substitutes we have here, and you can go through these and think about these. One thing that I like to give as a general example is if you go to a restaurant and you have a menu, the menu is often broken down into appetizers, the main course, and desserts and beverages, right? So you can think of substitutes are the things within each one of those sections of the menu. So appetizers, you have a choice of a number of appetizers, and generally speaking, they're substitutes. But across the categories are complements, right? So you might want to have an appetizer and it complements the main dish, or the main dish is complemented by the beverage. So the fourth determinant we're going to look at is tastes. Taste is a little bit more fuzzy than the other determinants, and it just represents a general preference, which can change over time. As economists, we're not really interested in taste per se. We're more interested in what happens when tastes do change. Taste, how you define it, is if you have an increased taste for a particular good, then that would increase your demand. So tastes are positively related to demand. So things become more or less popular. So tastes are positively related to individual demand. Fifth determinant that we're going to go through is expectations. And expectations is a little tricky because there's so many different potential cases to go through. It's better just to understand the concept. What it's getting at is choices made over time. Instead of in a current period of time deciding between Coke and Pepsi as the substitutes, here what you're deciding is between Coke now or Coke in the future, and that's your substitute, right? So what you expect to happen in the future can affect your decision today. So it's the current purchase versus future purchase. And of course, there's plenty of examples you can think of this, right? So if you think your income is going to increase in the future, it might not be higher now, but you think it's going to increase in the future, you might go ahead and increase your consumption and increase your demand today. Or maybe vice versa, if you think your income is going to fall in the future, you might cut back on your consumption today. And then there's other considerations as well. If you think that prices are going to increase in the future, you might go ahead and purchase it today. Again, vice versa, maybe you think prices are going to fall in the future, so you wait and reduce your purchases today to buy more in the future when you think the price is going to be lower. So what you think is going to happen in the future can affect your decisions today, and that's really that's what we're referring to when we say expectations. All right, so let's summarize the 5 determinants of demand that we went through. Price, income, price of related goods, taste, and expectations. So there's a couple of things to remember. Price, that's related to quantity demand, not demand. All the other ones are related to demand. Income, that has a differential relationship with demand depending on the type of good, right? Whether it's a normal good or an inferior good. And then price of related goods, the relationship that has depends on whether it's a price of a complement or a price of a substitute. And then taste and expectations, final 2 determinants. So now let's move to the demand curve. So technically speaking, the demand curve is essentially the graphical representation of the relationship between prices and quantity demanded. So P and Q sub D. And that was the first determinant that we went through, right? Prices related to quantity demanded. Demand curve is a graphical representation of the demand schedule. So each individual, while they don't explicitly have a demand schedule in their head, they act as if they do. So here's an example of a demand schedule. You have prices of movie tickets and the quantity demanded of movie tickets, right? So the price of tickets and the number of tickets demanded or purchased. So if the price of a movie ticket was zero, essentially they were handing them out for free, zero price, this individual might go to 10 movies, purchase 10 movies at zero cost. But what if they raise the price to $2 a ticket? So this individual might say, well, it costs $2 now, so I'll go to 8 instead of 10. They cut back. And if the price goes up to $4 per ticket, they cut back to 6 movies. And all the way up to 10, right? So if the price goes up to 10, it might get to the point where that individual decides, well, I don't want to go to any more movies. $10 is too much for me to go to even one movie. So this illustrates this negative relationship that we talked about when we mentioned prices as a determinant of demand. As prices go up, quantity demand goes down, or vice versa. If prices decline, quantity demand goes up. So what we're doing with the demand curve is essentially just plotting out these points from the demand schedule. And then this is what you end up with. All right, so we start with price is 0 and the number of tickets purchased will be 10. On the other extreme, where the price is 10 and you purchase 0 tickets, that's the other extreme, right? And then you can plot out the individual points. The diagram points out the point where it has the price is 4 and the quantity is 6. So this graph gives you the same information graphically as the demand curve does in terms of numbers. So what we're going to be looking at in the course when we look at demand and supply and putting them together, we're going to be looking at it graphically, right? But that line you need to understand that line comes from some data. It's not just drawn out of nowhere, right? It comes from somewhere in this demand schedule. Another thing to remember is that it's downward sloping. That's graphically represents that negative relationship. If you pick a point on that line and you move to another point, then your price and quantity are moving in the opposite direction. So if you increase price, you move along that curve and you're going to be decreasing quantity. If you decrease price, you're going to move down the demand curve and that's going to be increasing quantity. So that downward sloping demand curve illustrates the negative relationship between price and quantity demand. So let's take this one step further and turn this individual demand curve into a market demand curve. It's not going to look any different for our purposes. Intuitively though, the market demand curve is essentially the summation of all the individual demand curves. So if you take everyone's demand curve and just add them up, you'll get the market curve. So we've been considering the individual demand curves because sometimes it's easier to think about these determinants driving an individual's choice. And it does that at the individual level, but in the aggregate, you get the overall effect of these determinants or these changes in the determinants. So we're going to focus on the market demand curve moving forward. All right, the last part of this video lecture is demand and quantity demanded. What I'm trying to do here is make the distinction between demand and quantity demanded, and it's critical to understand this distinction as we move forward. So what we have, the underlying issue here, is not an economic issue, it's a graphical issue. The demand curve is an illustration between price and quantity for the buyer. Quantity demand is the quantity for the buyer. And the demand curve gives you that relationship between price and quantity. So it only allows price and quantity to change. Nothing else can change, and we're limited to just price and quantity because we're limited to a two-dimensional illustration. Now we could try to draw a three-dimensional graph, and anything more than that's impossible. We just stick to a two-dimensional graph that can look at two variables at a time, price and quantity. So if we illustrate that relationship between price and quantity with the demand curve, it holds everything else constant. Right? That's what ceteris paribus means. All else equal. Nothing else is changing when you look at that demand curve. Right? The only thing that can change along that demand curve is price and quantity. While you're moving up and down the demand curve, none of the other determinants are allowed to change. Income stays the same. Prices of related goods stay the same. Tastes stay the same, and expectations stay the same. They're held constant. All else is equal. That's what that means. Now, if one of those determinants changes, income, prices of related goods, tastes, or expectations, if one of those determinants change, then that line is no longer valid. We have violated the assumption of all else equal, and that means we have to draw a new line. Right? We violated the assumption. There's a new line, and there's a shift or a change in demand. So if something other than price changes, we have to draw a new demand curve. And that can be a demand curve that moves to the right or a demand curve that moves to the left. So this gets at why price was related to quantity demanded, right? Because you can move up and down the curve. Where all the other determinants were related to demand, because then you have to move the curve. You have to draw a whole new curve. All right, so let's look at this with a few examples. So first we're going to look at a change in demand. So there's a change in demand, not quantity demand, demand. And that is represented by a shift in the curve. Right? So as we said, if something other than price changes, you have to shift the curve. You have to change the curve. So this change, for example, let's say that income increases. That's something other than price, so the demand curve has to be redrawn, right? And if income increases, that means, for a normal good anyway, demand increases. So that's represented by a shift out in the curve, a shift to the right. Let's look at another example. Let's suppose that price of a complement increases. You remember, price of a complement has a negative relationship with demand. So if prices increase, demand's going to decrease. And that's a shift to the left of the demand curve. So an increase in demand is a shift to the right, a decrease in demand is a shift to the left. And what causes the shift in the curve is when something other than price changes. So a change in demand implies that there is a shift in the curve. So now let's look at a change in quantity demanded, right? So quantity demanded, not demand. And in this case, you have a movement along the curve. So this is a change in price leads to a change in quantity demanded. And that's because you move along the curve. You don't have to draw a new curve. For example, if prices decrease from P1 to P2, quantity demand is going to increase from Q1 to Q2. So that's the distinction. A change in quantity demanded is a movement along the curve. A change in demand is a shift in the curve. And we'll go back through this when we get to supply. The same concept applies to the supply curve. That's the end of this video lecture. Don't forget to read the corresponding parts of the text. Review your notes, and you can always revisit parts of the video lecture that you wish to see again, that you might have trouble understanding. And as always, feel free to send me emails with your questions.